Welcome to a new edition of the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino. On this episode, we talk with working capital leader and author Peter Kingma. Along with being the author of the book Cash is King, he is the America's working capital leader for EY Parthenon. Working across a variety of sectors, including automotive, aerospace, defense, healthcare, retail, and consumer products, he advises business leaders on how to optimize the management of cash. His work has led to well over $25 billion of value creation for his clients. He is a regular contributor to leading business publications and podcasts, often speaking at industry events about his areas of expertise. He lives in both Chicago and Columbia, Missouri. He's got quite a story. Enjoy.
Well, hey, man, it's great to meet you, and I would love to begin our conversation before we get into your fascinating life and Cash is King by asking you about the pandemic. Right now we're in that 4-year anniversary mark. How did you make it through that time period, and how did it change you?
Wow, great question. Well, I spent most of the pandemic in Missouri. We pretty much shut down going in person to the office in Chicago, and Chicago was not a great place to be in the early stages because everything was closed. And I live on Lakeshore Drive, and I can look out at the park and the lake, and even that was closed. They had everything barricaded. So spent most of my time in Columbia. It was a big adjustment, right? I'm a very social person and really very much of an extrovert. So not being around people it really took its toll on me. I don't know, how did you fare through it?
It's interesting because you mentioned going to parks and, being in Missouri, you can really get out and about. And being in the KC Metro, there's a lot of opportunities to do it. It was strange, man. I mean, the one thing I did more than anything else is I really ramped up my interviews. And at that time, I was pretty much exclusively doing jazz radio. So I was talking to musicians all over the world that had their itinerary that was just blown away in one day. And but the overall timbre and vibe of that community was strength and positivity. So it was actually good to hear their voices and to hear that glass half full kind of a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. I was at I don't know if you're familiar with the True False Film Festival in Columbia, but it's become actually I think the largest documentary film festival in the country now. And I remember in 2020 we were just in the middle of the festival when they announced that South by Southwest was canceling because of this new pandemic thing this new contagion that was coming from Europe, and I remember we all kind of thought, that's crazy. I can't believe they're canceling South by Southwest. And then a week or so later, everything comes to a complete halt. But it's wild to think that was 4 years ago.
Yeah, it really is. And the weird thing, to put kind of things into some level of relativity, about a week and a half or 2 weeks before the pandemic started, I was trying to get my son into watching hockey. We were watching the Blues. And there was a player, I think through San Jose, that collapsed after the first period, and they called the game. And I remember coming out of his room. He was going to bed, and I was like, tell my wife, I said, they just canceled the hockey game. And it was explaining it. And not to take anything away from what happened, but it was just, you don't see that. Things weren't getting canceled. They would do anything they could to keep the game going. And then little did we know that the entire world and every entertainment landscape was going to be permanently altered.
Yeah, and permanent is probably the right way. Probably just still some haven't fully recovered, right? To a certain degree, yeah. Because I think there's a lot of people that still won't come back. I think there's just a lot of protocols that are still in place. It's kind of like after 9/11, the world just changed in a way that it was never going to go back to before. Yeah, absolutely.
So, but I'm curious. I want to get to the heart and soul of what you do on a daily basis here in 2024. So I'm going to put you in front of a bunch of third graders at Career Day. One of the kids is curious and looks up and says, hey, what do you do for a living? How would you answer that child?
Oh, man, and I have to, Career Day, it's probably those kids are going to be so disappointed at my career then. But, so I work for EY Parthenon, which is, part of Ernst & Young. And I work with mostly big companies, but could be small companies as well. but to work with them on improving all aspects of cash generation and cash preservation. So how a business generates cash, and then the decisions that they make that will either preserve it or consume cash. And you know what I find interesting is that most businesses are organized around profit and loss, right? So most businesses and most people in businesses fully understand the importance of revenue. They understand the importance of cost containment. And in many cases, they know what their roles are in both of those equations, how to get a sale, how to keep costs down. But in most businesses, there's a sort of a lack of understanding of the balance sheet and how to generate cash, and the decisions that you make on a day-to-day basis that will impact cash. So one quick example of that would be, I go out and I chase a sale, I get a big sale, but with that I agree to 120-day payment terms, or I agree to certain service level commitments. All of those things will impact then the consumption of cash, and I may or may not even know it, or I may or may not know, the impact that has. And so that's fascinating to me. So I've spent the past, 20 plus years of my career working with companies to try and address that and to help them, improve cash flow, because that's the real mark of a healthy company. And, what I say in my book too is that, you can be a profitable business and still go bankrupt if you don't have adequate cash flow.
So I got to ask you, when you were in that position in the third grade, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to be an architect all through high school. And one summer in high school, we had some friends in our town in Indiana. They were all getting together and redoing a theater in town. And one of the friends was the lead architect on it. And he knew that I was interested in that. And they had these blueprints that were in terrible condition. And this is back in the 80s. And so he asked me if I would re-render the blueprints. So for an entire summer, while all my friends were out having fun, I sat at a drafting table, measuring lines and redrawing blueprints. And that's when I realized that I'd be better off in finance versus being an architect.
So talk to me a little bit about, take me back to where you were born and raised, and how these seeds of, having this vision of money and helping people get to better places. How did all these seeds get planted and become who you are?
Yeah, I don't, that's a good question. I don't know if I can really connect all the dots. I grew up in Indiana. I was the sixth of six kids, so it was pretty clear that I was a mistake. My dad was a small town banker, mom, stay-at-home mom, great family, and went to college, studied economics, and started my career at IBM, and then kind of gravitated more toward consulting, and had spent, the bulk of my career advising companies, and as mentioned, the past 20 years or so, being really focused around working capital and cash. What I love about what I do is that I get to solve problems, and, maybe that says I've got a short attention span, I'm not sure, but I love to get in and solve, kind of complex problems for clients. And the other thing is about the work is I can see the benefits. I mean, it's not a sort of one of these areas where, you do some work and you're not 100% sure if you've had impact. The good thing about what we do is I can measure the impact. I can measure the cash improvement. And that capital and that cash keeps people employed. I mean, if I look at the companies that I've worked with over the years, they're much more resilient. And they represent, a lot of people who work for those businesses, who, we keep them employed, and, because of this, improving the strength of those companies.
It's fascinating you say that. It's an actual empirical, measurable result to know what you're doing, because sometimes you have no idea in certain jobs what you're doing. You can assume, but you don't know. Did you ever watch that show called Monk? Yeah, I did. Okay. Not all of it, but yeah. Yep. Okay. Well, they came out with the movie, and it's perfect because he's a germaphobe, and he's in 2020, and he's like, oh, my God, I've been waiting for this my whole life. to have sanitizer everywhere and gloves and that. You know what I'm saying? So it was like perfect timing for it. But there was one point, and this shouldn't give too much away, but it was an actual movie. And at one point, and he did this sometimes in the series, he would get to a point where he was like, I don't know why I'm doing this. Like, I don't see the results. I know I'm solving things, but I don't know what the measurable is. And at one point, he was sitting on a bench, and all of the relatives and the ghosts that he had helped solve the murders came up to him. And it was pretty hardcore. And it's like you're saying, like, sometimes I think we spend our lives working and we don't know exactly what we're doing. You know, we don't know if we're actually making an impact. But with what you're doing, that's wonderful. You know exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, again, it's fun to see. You know, these are in many cases very well-known companies that, and not all of them are struggling. Not all of my clients are you know, in a sort of point where they're going through problems. But in some cases they are, and these are very, you know, iconic companies that I can look back kind of with pride and say that, you know, because of the work we did, we enabled them to generate the kind of capital that they need to stay competitive and to continue to produce the great products and services that they do. But then I like the human aspect of it as well. But to think about, you know, all of the people, the families that are dependent on these businesses and that are employed because of the kind of decisions and the improvements that we were able to make. Yeah, it is pretty cool.
So let me ask you this. Who's been a hero for you, an inspiration in your life?
Well, I'd say my parents. I'd start with, you know, they you know, instilled great values. They always, you know, sacrificed everything for their kids. My dad was, you know, again, in this small town, I think he probably served on every volunteer board and everything that that they had out there. In fact, when he retired, the local paper did a mock, you know, headline announcing his retirement, you know, a special edition sort of thing to give to him. And my mom, you know, was a saint, you know, managing a household of, you know, 6 kids on one income and somehow making everything work. Those are probably the 2 heroes in my life.
So if you could meet one person alive on the planet right now that you find fascinating, who would you love to meet and talk to?
I'd love to meet Warren Buffett while he's still with us. I mean, what a fascinating guy. You know, seems to be very down to earth with all he's accomplished, but also seems to be very practical. And you know, and especially for what I do for a living, he's frequently talks about the importance of cash and how that's the true measure of a value of a company. So I'd love to spend an afternoon with Warren Buffett.
Yeah, the whole idea that he's been in the same house with the same car, he kind of orders the same thing. It's like the whole story, the backstory on him is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
And giving all his money away, right? You know, like this was never about, you know, super opulent lifestyle. It was always about creating something, building something, and then giving it away to greater good.
You know, I heard an interview with that Mr. Beast, and he was kind of talking about the same thing, where his whole idea is to reinvest in what he's doing and then give it away. And for a long time there, I think he had roommates and was living in an apartment, and once everybody found out who he was, he literally had to move for security reasons. Otherwise, he would have kept doing it. I heard Brock Purdy, the quarterback for the 49ers, still had roommates and was still carpooling and doing things. It's just so weird to think, you know?
Yeah. No,
it's wild. So let me ask you this. Every day you wake up, you're helping people, but you also have to evolve as a human being yourself. What is that motivation for you every day to do all of those things?
Well, I guess I'm interested. You know, like I said, I like to solve problems. I'm interested and curious in learning new things. So, you know, honestly, for the past 2 years, I spent writing a book. Right? I'd never written. You know, honestly, if I kind of think about it, I probably hadn't really written anything of any length since high school. I studied economics in college, and I don't think we had to write an awful lot. And then I spent my whole professional career writing PowerPoints and incomplete sentences. So to sit down and actually write a book was quite challenging. And I decided early on that I wanted it not to be a textbook. So I created a fictitious company, and I wrote a story that every chapter the characters are trying to solve some problem. So for the past couple of years, that's been a fun challenge, is getting up, trying to think through, how am I actually going to commit time to put pen to paper and to write something that hopefully people would want to read. But I guess that sort of your bigger question is, why do something like that? And it's because I like to learn. I like to challenge myself. I like like to be curious about new endeavors. So I guess now that this is all over, I'm going to have to find something new to occupy my time, or I'm going to drive everybody I know crazy if I don't find some new project.
So let me ask you this. Yeah, and I think anybody that's attempted to write a book has to understand how difficult it is. There are so many moving parts, and even getting a draft done is only the beginning, because it's got to go through the mill and the editing and to get to a point where you're actually got it in your hands and you're promoting it. There's so much that goes into all of that.
Yeah, there was a lot of stops and starts. When I started out, I didn't know, what device I was going to use, this story device. And so there were a lot of stops and starts along the way. But, I got good advice from folks who have written before, who said, you can't edit as you go. You just have to force yourself to get stuff on paper and then go back later and then edit. And so once I kind of gave myself permission to just write and not be overly worried about what I was putting on paper, that was kind of the breakthrough moment. And then I could just, focus on just getting something done and then going back and then, refining it and editing. But it was pretty tedious at the beginning, but it got more fun as I went along. And if, if you have a chance to read the book, you'll see I have tried to use humor, whether or not I was effective or not, we'll see. But tried to make it light and humorous as well, and so that was kind of fun too, to bring the characters to life, and try and talk about something that could have been a pretty dry subject matter, but hopefully doing so in something that was more entertaining.
So in the book, you're dispensing advice and wisdom, and I'm curious, as one that's doing that, what's the best advice you've ever gotten?
Well, it's probably not exactly related to working capital or cash, but the best advice was you're never as good as you think you are, and you're never as bad as you think you are. And that's gotten me through a lot of tricky situations and bad days. So on the days when just seemingly in weeks and, when nothing is going right, I remind myself that, I'm not really, there are going to be better days. I'm not as bad as I really think I am. And the days when I'm just killing it and at the top of the game, it's sort of good to sort of step aside and take myself down a notch or two and say, you have low points too. You're not really as good as you think you are.
So of all of the clients and all the people that you've worked with over the years, what's one of your favorite success stories?
Wow. Good question. Probably some of the ones earlier on where I was, when I was just getting started out. So there was a company, an apparel company, that had just a crazy amount of inventory. The CFO at the time said, I think I'm sitting on 30 years worth of inventory. I don't think that was probably accurate, but this was a company with a lot of young merchants who were making decisions, oftentimes without really fully understanding the ramifications of the decisions. This was a company that at the time was red hot. It was very, their designs and their products were very in demand among young people. So in some cases, one would ask, well, don't mess with the formula, but the CFO wisely saw that they were tying up, significant amount of capital in the business that they needed, that they needed to continue to grow and deploy elsewhere. And so it was a tricky situation. It's like, how do you help them but not screw up what's making them successful. And so that required that I jump into the business and try and, very quickly understand all aspects of their merchant process, planning process, buying process, et cetera, and find opportunities then to improve the stages of that so that they could continue to grow fast, but also not tying up all the capital. So that was a fun project because it was something very new that I had to learn, but also, it wasn't obvious right out of the gate what we had to do to help them.
So let's say you have a dream tonight. You run into the 18-year-old version of you, and you can give that young version of you a piece of advice based on the wisdom you've gained in your life up to this point. What advice would you give your younger self?
Wear sunscreen and and moisturizer. I think the younger version of me thought that life was going to be linear. That I used to think like you had to get into a certain school, so that you had to get a certain kind of job, and then you had to have get promoted at a certain point, and that everything was all about linearity. And I don't think that's the way life works. I don't think we would want that to be the way life works. I think there's lots of twists and turns, and there are a lot of days where, like I talk about, setback days and days that when you're on top of the world. So I think my advice to my younger self would be don't overly, don't stress too much and don't fret too much. Because back then at 18, I was trying to figure out what college to get into and what to do in college. And not that that's not important, but, I probably put way too much emphasis on that, thinking that, you had to do things in a certain order.
So of all of the things that you've done in your life so far, what are you the proudest of?
I think relationships. I'm in a 30-year relationship. Met my partner 30 years ago, and he's a law professor at Mizzou, and that's why we go back and forth between Chicago and Columbia. But that's very important to me, that relationship. My relationship with my family and friends. At the end of the day, those are far more important than any sort of material possessions to me.
So I got to know, what is the best thing about living in Columbia, and what's the best thing about living in Chicago?
It's a great combination for sure, because, I do love city. I'm sitting in Chicago right now. I love the vibrancy of the city, but then I also love to get down to Columbia on the weekends and walk around, and we know everybody. We know all the shopkeepers and, fun little restaurants and coffee places. Of course, being able to go, this was a great year to have season tickets to Mizzou football. Was very good. But I like the combination of small town college town with sort of big city offerings that Chicago has to offer.
That is pretty cool to be able to live that, because you are going from a metropolis to kind of a small town with that college town. Because when you do get to those college towns, you just feel the energy. College kids have this level of energy that's very eclectic and very distinct.
Absolutely. The downside is every year I get older, and every year they stay the same age. They're all between 18 and 22. But no, college towns are great because they're such a great collection of people from all around the world. Interesting academics, interesting people in the arts and sports. So it really is it's a concentrate. When you think about it, a city of only 100,000 people or so, it's a concentration of really interesting backgrounds.
So at the end of the day, everyone, Peter, they have a version or an idea or perception of you, family, friends, clients, but ultimately you are in control. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Who do I want myself to be, or who do I think I am?
I guess who do you think? Yeah. I mean, it could be both. We could work that out.
Yeah, this is free therapy now that you're offering me. This is great.
This is the therapy hour.
That's right. Yeah. So positives and negatives. I think I probably am perceived as being somebody who can solve problems. And that's probably a good thing and a bad thing, because sometimes, the best thing to do is just to listen and to be there to support people. I have a tendency to hear something and then to immediately want to jump into problem-solving mode and to try and correct things. I think that's just baked into my DNA. That's just part of who I am and probably what I do professionally. So I think that's a big aspect of my personality. I'm like I said, I'm very curious, so I like to talk to people, and I probably don't talk about myself very much when I'm around other folks. That I kind of go into interview mode and really like to draw people out. I'd like to think that somebody gave me a compliment and I love it, and I would like to try and live up to that. That there are people that amplify others, and so that's a aspirational goal. I'd like to be that kind of a person that amplifies other people.
So, Peter, if anyone wants to pick up Cash is King, learn more about you, reach out, any of the good business, where's the best place to go?
Well, so Cash is King is available right now for sale on all the different sites, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. I also have a website, peterkingma.com, and you can link from there to all those sites to purchase the book. You can also put your email in at that site, and you'll get you can download the introduction, but then also we'll send out periodic updates of different things that are happening. All the other media, podcast interviews, different things like that are also on that website as well.
Excellent. Peter, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your story. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
I love it. It was a great conversation, and thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to another famous interview with Joe Dimino, where we cover the world of art, literature, business, spirituality, music, and more from around the globe. Our esteemed theme music was composed and produced by the great E.E. Pointer of Kansas City's River Cow Orchestra. If you want to hear more interviews, visit the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino channel on YouTube. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.